In just 4 years, an invisible killer wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. Entire villages disappeared. Cities became graveyards. Kings, priests, and physicians stood helpless as medieval civilization faced its greatest catastrophe. This was the Black Death. The vast, arid expanse of the Central Asian steppe stretches for thousands of miles, forming a harsh landscape of endless grasslands and jagged mountain ranges that had long birthed nomadic empires. During the early decades of the 1330s, this massive geographic region experienced a profound and devastating ecological disruption. Prolonged periods of severe drought, rapidly followed by sudden, erratic shifts in regional rainfall, fundamentally altered the sparse vegetation of the steppes. The changing climate forced subterranean rodent populations, primarily large colonies of marmots and gerbils, to migrate outward from their increasingly inhospitable burrows in search of sustaining food sources. These small animals carried a microscopic passenger quietly circulating within their bloodstream, the Yersinia pestis bacterium. For countless centuries, the pathogen had existed harmlessly among isolated rodent colonies, kept securely in check by the sheer vastness and isolation of the uninhabited plains. The climate-driven migration shattered this delicate biological equilibrium. As the wild rodents moved across the grasslands, they carried with them the oriental rat flea, the primary biological vector for the deadly disease. The migrating animals soon converged with the expanding pastoral camps of nomadic herders, moving their flocks across the grazing lands. Fleas readily abandoned dying marmots, actively seeking new hosts among the highly adaptable black rats that infested human grain stores, fabric bales, and animal pens. The bacterium rapidly adapted to its new environment, successfully crossing the species barrier and entering the human population of the steppes. Hunters trapping marmots for their valuable pelts became the first inadvertent casualties, abruptly falling victim to violent fevers, agonizing joint pain, and grotesque lymphatic swellings. The timing of this unprecedented zoonotic spillover coincided perfectly with the commercial apex of the Pax Mongolica, a historical period of unparalleled geopolitical stability imposed by the fragmented but still highly functional Mongol Empire. A continuous, unified network of overland trade routes stretched unbroken from the eastern borders of China directly to the western shores of the Black Sea. This vast commercial artery, heavily guarded by armed Mongol cavalry patrols, allowed merchants, diplomats, and entire armies to traverse the Eurasian landmass with unprecedented speed and general safety. The sophisticated Mongol postal relay system, known as the Yam, featured fortified way stations spaced exactly a single day's ride apart, providing fresh horses, armed escorts, and supplies to imperial messengers. These same way stations inadvertently became highly efficient staging grounds for the invisible pathogen. Infected black rats routinely stowed away in heavy grain sacks, tightly bound bales of raw silk, and the thick woolen coats of passing travelers. The bacterium advanced steadily westward, hitching rides with outbound commercial caravans moving from station to station. Contemporary Syrian writers recorded troubling rumors of a great, unstoppable pestilence devastating the lands of the Uzbeks and the distant regions of Cathay. Archaeological excavations near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan have uncovered enclosed Christian trading settlements where the cemetery headstones abruptly multiplied during the specific years of 1338 and 1339. The Syriac inscriptions etched deeply into the stone plainly state the terrifying cause of death, pestilence. From Issyk-Kul, the infected caravans pushed onward, crossing the arid Caspian Basin and descending steadily toward the fertile, heavily populated plains of the Caucasus. The pathogen traveled not through the slow, chaotic movement of migrating tribes, but rather through the highly organized, accelerated arteries of international commerce. By the middle of the 1340s, the disease approached the Crimean Peninsula, a vital strategic juncture where the overland Asian trade networks, seamlessly met the bustling maritime routes of the Mediterranean world. Perched securely on the southern coast of the peninsula sat the heavily fortified, fiercely independent city of Caffa. Administered directly by the powerful Republic of Genoa, Caffa functioned as the undisputed commercial capital of the entire Black Sea region. The ambitious Italian merchants had transformed the isolated coastal enclave into a thriving, cosmopolitan metropolis built of solid stone houses, protected by formidable defensive walls, and featuring deep-water harbors perfectly capable of docking massive commercial galleys. Genoese magistrates skillfully managed a highly lucrative flow of eastern spices, raw silk, grain, and human slaves, funneling the immense wealth of Asia directly into the waiting European economy. This undeniable mercantile dominance deeply chafed against the territorial authority of the regional Mongol power, the mighty Golden Horde. Commanded by Yani Beg, the aggressive Mongol Khan deliberately sought to crush the Genoese monopoly and assert total military control over the lucrative Crimean trade network. Tensions over inflated grain prices and heavily taxed slave markets rapidly ignited into open, violent conflict. In 1345, the Khan mobilized his forces, marching a massive Tatar army across the Pontic steppe to formally besiege the wealthy Italian stronghold. Yani Beg completely encircled Caffa, successfully cutting off all landward approaches and isolating the garrison. His military engineers systematically erected sprawling siege camps, positioned heavy timber trebuchets just out of bowshot, and began an endless, punishing barrage of stone projectiles against the Genoese battlements. The Italian defenders, relying heavily on their superior stone masonry and continuous naval resupply arriving safely from the sea, successfully repelled the initial infantry assaults. The Mongols immediately dug in for a protracted war of attrition, sealing the city behind an impenetrable ring of earthworks and waiting patiently for starvation to inevitably break the Genoese resolve. The grueling siege held steady through the freezing winter and into the following year without yielding a decisive victory for either side. The sprawling Tatar encampments, densely packed with tens of thousands of active soldiers, cavalry horses, camp followers, and essential pack animals, inadvertently created a biologically ideal environment for the rapid spread of infectious disease. In the autumn of 1346, the invisible pathogen finally caught up with the stationary forces of the Golden Horde. The plague erupted violently within the besieging ranks with terrifying, unprecedented speed. Hardened soldiers abruptly awoke with agonizing, apple-sized buboes rapidly swelling in their groins, necks, and armpits. Dangerously high fevers, severe delirium, and internal bleeding followed within hours, almost always resulting in an agonizing death within 3 to 5 days. The rigid military cohesion of the Tatar army evaporated overnight as the daily death toll climbed rapidly into the hundreds, and then quickly into the thousands. Traditional medical officers and spiritual shamans proved entirely powerless to halt or even understand the rampant contagion spreading through the tents. Military burial details physically could not dig mass graves fast enough, ultimately leaving thousands of infected corpses to rot openly inside the military encampments and along the entrenched siege lines. As the Genoese notary and chronicler Gabriel de Mussy later recorded, the fierce Mongols were completely stunned and stupefied by this terrible disaster, quickly realizing that their overwhelming numerical superiority meant absolutely nothing against the sudden, invisible slaughter dismantling their ranks. Blind panic swept uncontrollably through the surviving detachments. Terrified deserters fled the infected camps by the thousands, attempting desperately to escape back into the open steppe, only to inadvertently carry the lethal infection much further into the vulnerable inner territories of the Golden Horde. Yani Beg faced the absolute, total annihilation of his primary military forces. His grand, ambitious campaign to conquer the wealth of Caffa was collapsing spectacularly, defeated not by the heavy swords of the Genoese defenders, but by an uncontrollable, apocalyptic biological catastrophe. Faced with absolute, humiliating defeat and the imminent, total disintegration of his command, the Khan made a desperate, historically unprecedented tactical decision. Refusing stubbornly to abandon the costly siege without striking one final, devastating blow against his entrenched enemies, Yani Beg explicitly ordered his remaining artillerymen to systematically load the heavy trebuchets with the infected, rotting corpses of his own fallen soldiers. The massive wooden siege engines, originally designed and built to hurl heavy granite stones and volatile incendiary devices, were rapidly realigned and recalibrated for a different kind of payload. With the deafening snap of heavy torsion ropes, the Mongol engineers repeatedly launched the diseased bodies high over the towering stone walls of Caffa. The macabre, decaying projectiles rained down relentlessly upon the terrified Genoese city, smashing violently into wooden rooftops, shattering sickeningly against the narrow cobblestone streets, and plunging directly into the exposed municipal wells. The besieged Italians watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the rotting, plague-ridden corpses rapidly accumulated within their tightly confined living spaces. Demusy vividly describes the desperate defenders frantically attempting to dispose of the overwhelming biological hazards, physically dragging the mangled bodies to the steep cliffs and dumping them unceremoniously into the dark, churning waters of the Black Sea. The massive disposal effort proved utterly, tragically futile. The prevailing medieval understanding of disease centered entirely around miasma, the deeply entrenched belief that corrupted, foul-smelling air physically transmitted illness. The Genoese naturally believed the overwhelming, inescapable stench of the decomposing Tatar flesh was actively poisoning their breathable air supply. In terrifying reality, the true, lethal threat crawled entirely unnoticed among the freshly dead. The oriental rat fleas, surviving the brutal aerial bombardment, quickly abandoned the cold, lifeless Mongol corpses and actively sought fresh, warm-blooded hosts within the densely packed, highly populated city. They found an immediate, perfect sanctuary among the native black rats thriving inside the grain silos, busy bakeries, and cramped merchant quarters of Caffa. Within a matter of mere weeks, the exact same horrific symptoms that had utterly destroyed the massive Tatar army began to manifest rapidly among the terrified Italian population. The strict defensive discipline of the fortified city completely shattered as the lethal contagion spread relentlessly from narrow street to narrow street. Respected magistrates, veteran soldiers, and wealthy merchants collapsed suddenly in their private homes or died agonizingly in the public alleyways. Recognizing clearly that the impregnable fortress had inadvertently become an inescapable death trap, the surviving Genoese elite made the fateful, historic decision to entirely abandon Caffa. In the chaotic early months of 1347, wealthy merchants and experienced ship captains rushed desperately to the guarded docks, frantically loading their remaining portable wealth, valuable trade goods, and surviving family members onto a specialized fleet of heavily armed galleys. Panicked sailors feverishly prepped the complex rigging and hoisted the heavy canvas sails, desperate to escape the duel, closing threats of the lingering Mongol siege lines and the invisible pestilence actively ravaging the city streets behind them. As the exhausted crews loaded the final, crucial crates of cargo and essential provisions, they unknowingly brought aboard the silent architects of their own impending destruction. Flea-infested black rats scurried unnoticed up the thick hemp mooring lines and hid themselves deep within the dark, humid, inaccessible holds of the wooden vessels. The Genoese galleys slipped quietly past the decimated, disorganized remnants of the Tatar blockades, breaking out safely into the open, cold waters of the Black Sea. The experienced captains confidently charted a direct course southwest, aiming their bows specifically for the Bosphorus Strait and the perceived safety of the Mediterranean. Below the heavy wooden decks, the microscopic pathogen multiplied silently in the dark, traveling faster than it ever had along the dusty overland caravans, securely locked within the fast-moving hulls of ships sailing directly toward the unsuspecting heart of Europe. The surviving galleys from the Black Sea cut through the dark waters of the Mediterranean, propelled by prevailing autumn winds. Below their heavy timber decks, the cargo holds contained wealthy merchant families, exotic trade goods, and the invisible biological agent that had devastated the Tatar army. In October 1347, 12 Genoese galleys steered toward the northeastern coast of Sicily, dropping anchor in the deep-water port of Messina. This bustling harbor served as a vital maritime crossroads, perfectly positioned to connect the Byzantine East with the lucrative markets of the Italian peninsula. As the dockworkers secured the heavy mooring lines and the harbor masters approached the arriving vessels to inspect the cargo, they discovered a horrifying scene. Contemporary chronicles report that the crews manning the rigging stood entirely paralyzed by severe illness. Sailors lay groaning on the wooden planks, their bodies ravaged by high fevers and disfigured by large, blackened swellings localized around their groins and armpits. The disease had incubated during the long maritime journey, transforming the confined living quarters of the galleys into floating vectors of contagion. When the Messinese port officials boarded the ships to conduct standard customs assessments, they unwittingly stepped into an active biological hazard. Within hours of the fleet's arrival, dock workers handling the unloaded crates and merchants negotiating for Eastern silks unknowingly transported infected fleas deep into the heart of the Sicilian city. The rigid isolation the open sea had briefly provided immediately dissolved as the pathogen successfully established its first devastating beachhead on the European continent. Recognizing the immediate lethal threat presented by the arriving sailors, the local Sicilian authorities acted swiftly to sever contact. The city magistrates officially expelled the Genoese fleet from the harbor, ordering the sick and dying crews to raise their sails and leave Messinese waters under the threat of violent retaliation. Heavy galleys slowly detached from the stone piers and limped back into the open sea, but the administrative decree came too late to protect the island. Highly mobile black rats had already scurried down the mooring ropes and infiltrated the dense, narrow alleyways of the port district. This localized outbreak rapidly erupted across the bustling commercial districts of Messina with unprecedented, unstoppable ferocity. Local citizens abruptly developed the exact same dark buboes that had afflicted the expelled sailors. Panic rapidly overwhelmed the city's civic structure. Desperate sick flooded the local monastic hospitals, quickly exhausting the limited supplies of herbal remedies and overwhelming the attending monks and nuns. As the death toll escalated exponentially, the fundamental pillars of medieval social support disintegrated. Parish priests, traditionally responsible for administering the final sacraments and comforting the dying, contracted the disease at catastrophic rates through direct exposure to their parishioners. Consequently, the local clergy suffered such immense casualties that the religious infrastructure of the city entirely collapsed. Unburied bodies accumulated inside private homes and spilled out onto the public streets. Terrified survivors abandoned their properties, fleeing Messina on foot and horseback, desperately seeking refuge in the surrounding countryside and the inland city of Catania. Their panicked exodus inadvertently carried the pathogen further into the Sicilian interior, effectively condemning the rest of the island to the same rapid biological devastation. Cast out from Sicily, the desperate Genoese fleet fragmented, seeking any willing harbor along the Italian coastline. In early 1348, several of the heavily infected galleys managed to navigate the Tyrrhenian Sea and approach their home port of Genoa. Other surviving vessels sailed up the Adriatic, anchoring near the sprawling maritime empire of Venice. These two powerful republics stood as Europe's wealthiest and most densely populated commercial hubs, characterized by towering stone palazzos, packed merchant quarters, and constant international traffic. When the galleys finally docked, they transmitted the pathogen directly into the central arteries of the European economy. The governing councils of both cities quickly realized the immense danger. Genoese authorities, warned by the rapid spread of the sickness among the initial dock workers, deployed specialized military personnel to the harbor walls, launching flaming arrows at their own returning ships to force them back out to sea. Despite these aggressive military deterrents, the contagion successfully breached the city defenses. Infected sailors abandoned their vessels at night, swimming ashore or docking in smaller, unguarded coastal inlets along the Ligurian Riviera. Simultaneously, the disease infiltrated the Venetian lagoon. A complex network of canals and tightly packed island communities provided a biologically ideal environment for the rapid reproduction of rat populations. This sudden influx of the pathogen into these highly urbanized centers triggered a massive demographic catastrophe, transforming the vibrant economic capitals of the Mediterranean into vast, inescapable death traps. Faced with the systematic destruction of its population, the Republic of Venice utilized its highly centralized bureaucracy to pioneer the first institutional public health responses in European history. The Great Council appointed a specialized committee of 3 noblemen, the Savi alla Sanita, granting them absolute dictatorial authority to manage the escalating crisis. These magistrates implemented strict maritime regulations, actively isolating incoming ships suspected of carrying the sickness. They ordered all arriving merchant vessels to anchor at remote locations within the lagoon for a mandatory waiting period, theoretically allowing the disease to burn out before the cargo and crew could enter the main city. To manage the overwhelming accumulation of corpses blocking the narrow canals, the Venetian state commandeered entire fleets of flat-bottomed transport barges. State-appointed crews rowed through the city districts, loading the dead and transporting them across the water to isolated outer islands, specifically San Michele and Poveglia. Municipal authorities ordered the immediate excavation of massive, deep burial pits on these islands, systematically layering the infected bodies with heavy deposits of lime to accelerate decomposition and contain the foul odors. Despite these sophisticated administrative measures and immense logistical efforts, the Republic ultimately failed to contain the outbreak. Strict Venetian quarantines heavily restricted human movement, but proved entirely ineffective against the true biological vectors. Infected rats easily swam across the narrow waterways or bypassed the naval blockades aboard smaller smuggling skiffs, rendering the pioneering public health infrastructure tragically obsolete. While the maritime republics battled the pathogen along the coast, the disease advanced relentlessly inland, following the major trade roads into the heart of Tuscany. By mid-1348, the plague breached the walls of Florence, widely considered the cultural and financial center of the Italian peninsula. This immense impact on the city triggered a complete and catastrophic societal collapse. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, surviving the outbreak, recorded the absolute disintegration of civic order in his primary accounts. Civic administrative frameworks dissolved within weeks. Prominent magistrates, civic judges, and city watchmen either died in their beds or abandoned their official posts to flee to their fortified country estates. Without law enforcement to maintain order, the basic functions of municipal government ceased. An astronomical death rate quickly overwhelmed the established parish graveyards. The frantic city council desperately attempted to hire specialized grave diggers, known locally as the Beccini, openly offering exorbitant daily wages from the municipal treasury to physically clear the blocked streets of the rapidly decaying dead. However, as the mortality rate continued to climb, even these highly paid workers abandoned their grim tasks. Families locked themselves inside their homes, often leaving their sick relatives to die alone in isolated rooms. In many terrifying cases, entire wealthy households perished completely behind their heavy wooden doors, their fates only discovered when neighbors noticed the overwhelming stench of decomposition seeping through the walls. By the time the primary wave of the contagion finally subsided in the autumn, Florence had lost an estimated 60% of its total population. effectively halting the immense economic machinery of the Tuscan banking and textile industries. The rapid, uncontrollable slaughter deeply challenged the established medical faculties across the Italian peninsula. Physicians operating out of prestigious universities in Padua, Bologna, and Florence desperately consulted the classical Greek and Roman texts that formed the absolute foundation of medieval medical knowledge. Relying heavily on the established theories of Hippocrates and Galen, they predominantly attributed the devastating outbreak to miasma, a severe corruption of the air caused by the release of poisonous vapors from deep within the earth. To combat this foul air, doctors instructed the surviving population to burn fragrant woods, carry sweet-smelling herbs, and tightly seal their windows against the southern winds. Furthermore, the leading academic astrologers calculated that a recent rare conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius had actively poisoned the atmosphere, viewing the biological catastrophe as a direct result of celestial mechanics. These deeply entrenched classical frameworks left the medical community completely incapable of halting, or even fundamentally understanding, the physical transmission of the pathogen through fleas and rats. Medical practitioners who actively treated the sick, utilizing ineffective methods such as bloodletting and the lancing of the painful buboes, experienced incredibly high mortality rates themselves. The complete, systemic failure of the educated medical elites, the established religious institutions, and the traditional civic authorities to stop the relentless dying completely shattered fundamental public confidence across the fractured Italian states. Traumatized survivors stripped the wealth from the abandoned palazzos and left the silent cities behind. Meanwhile, the pathogen continued its relentless expansion northward, silently moving alongside the fleeing refugees, traveling steadily up the ancient Roman roads toward the snowy passes of the Alps, and crossing the borders into the massive, vulnerable territories of the Kingdom of France. Fleeing the devastated Mediterranean ports, desperate merchants and refugees carried the contagion northward along ancient trade routes. The pathogen breached the geographical barrier of the Alps in early 1348, descending rapidly into the fertile valleys of the Kingdom of France. Moving steadily along the Rhone River and trade roads connecting Provence to the northern provinces, the disease infiltrated fortified towns and rural manors with equal ferocity. Provincial governors barricaded their city gates against the influx of travelers, but infected black rats easily circumvented these quarantines, hiding in grain shipments and woolen textiles. By the summer of 1348, the plague reached Paris, the most populous city in northern Europe and the political center of the French crown. The densely packed urban environment of the capital, characterized by narrow, open sewer streets and overcrowded artisanal quarters, provided ideal conditions for the Yersinia pestis bacterium to multiply. Contemporary chronicles report that the daily death toll in the city quickly climbed into the hundreds, overwhelming the local infrastructure. Gravediggers at the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents worked continuously, excavating deep trenches to accommodate the relentless influx of corpses. Marketplaces that had previously supplied the vast Parisian population with grain and meat fell entirely silent as rural farmers refused to enter the infected capital. The royal guards abandoned their posts at the city gates, and the municipal administration fractured completely as magistrates fled to their rural estates. Confronted with the rapid disintegration of his capital and the catastrophic loss of his subjects, King Philip VI of France sought a definitive, scientific explanation for the unprecedented slaughter. He commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris to conduct a thorough investigation into the origins and nature of the pestilence. The assembled scholars, representing the highest intellectual authority in medieval Europe, retreated into their extensive libraries to consult the foundational medical texts of antiquity and Islamic scholars. After weeks of intense academic debate and astrological calculation, the medical faculty presented a formal treatise to the crown in October 1348. They concluded that the disaster did not originate from a localized miasma, but rather from a profound cosmic disturbance. The Parisian masters officially attributed the outbreak to a major astrological event, a specific, rare conjunction of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn in the sign of Aquarius, which had occurred at exactly 1 p.m. on March 20th, 1345. According to their published report, this planetary alignment had drawn poisonous vapors from the Earth and corrupted the global atmosphere. Philip VI received this scientifically endorsed document, but the astronomical explanation offered no practical medical solutions. The royal physicians simply advised the king to avoid bathing, to retreat from the corrupt air, and to consume crushed emeralds or theriac to protect his humoral balance. These academic recommendations proved entirely useless against the biological reality of flea-borne transmission, leaving the French monarchy powerless to halt the mounting death toll or protect the collapsing social order within its borders. As the French crown struggled to manage the crisis in Paris, the contagion directly threatened the spiritual center of Western Christendom. The papal court currently resided in Avignon, a heavily fortified city in southern France that housed the immense bureaucratic machinery of the Catholic Church. The plague struck Avignon with devastating force in the spring of 1348, sweeping relentlessly through the papal palaces, the cardinals' residences, and the crowded streets of the city. To protect the supreme pontiff, the papal physicians instructed Pope Clement VI to isolate himself entirely within his private chambers in the Palais des Papes. He retreated into a heavily sealed room, where attendants kept massive fires burning continuously on either side of his throne to artificially purify the surrounding air. From this isolated sanctuary, the Pope desperately attempted to manage the escalating crisis. The mortality rate in Avignon quickly exceeded the physical capacity of the city's consecrated graveyards. Papal clerks meticulously recorded that the death toll among the clergy and the lay population grew so massive that absolutely no available land remained for proper Christian burial. Faced with thousands of rotting corpses accumulating rapidly in the streets and threatening a secondary public health disaster, Clement VI issued an unprecedented spiritual decree. He formally consecrated the entire Rhone River, officially blessing its flowing waters as a massive, continuous burial ground. Municipal laborers physically loaded thousands of plague victims onto wooden carts. The waters of the English Channel temporarily shielded the Kingdom of England from the continental devastation, but the intensive maritime trade connecting the British Isles to Gascony eventually breached this natural defense. In late June 1348, a merchant vessel carrying shipments of Bordeaux wine navigated the turbulent channel and docked securely at the southern port of Melcombe Regis, in modern-day Weymouth. Aboard this ship was an infected Gascon sailor, unknowingly carrying the lethal pathogen directly onto English soil. As dockworkers unloaded the heavy wine casks, infected rats and their disease-carrying fleas disembarked into the bustling harbor town. The disease quickly established its first permanent English foothold in Dorset, striking the local coastal population with the same terrifying speed it had demonstrated across the European continent. Town officials initially attempted to isolate the sick inside their homes, but the highly contagious pneumonic and bubonic variants of the disease easily overwhelmed these localized containment efforts. The contagion moved swiftly along the southern coast, striking the major port cities of Bristol and Southampton before aggressively turning inland. It followed the primary trade routes, river networks, and marching paths, systematically moving from village to village. The traditional manorial system of the English countryside, built upon dense clusters of small peasant cottages surrounding local parish churches, actively facilitated the rapid transmission of the bacterium. Within mere months of the Gascon sailor stepping ashore, the unseen killer had firmly entrenched itself within the vital agricultural heartland of the Kingdom of England. By the autumn of 1348, the plague converged heavily upon London, a thriving commercial metropolis of roughly 70,000 inhabitants. The medieval city, confined tightly within its ancient Roman walls, offered a perfect breeding ground for the spreading pathogen. The infection ravaged the overcrowded wards, striking merchants, artisans, and laborers with indiscriminate lethality. The rapid influx of the dead immediately overwhelmed the established parish graveyards nestled within the city limits. Local rectors found themselves unable to process the sheer volume of daily burials, and the physical space required to inter the victims ran out. Recognizing the imminent threat of unburied bodies accumulating in the narrow streets, municipal authorities and prominent churchmen orchestrated an emergency intervention. The Bishop of London, Ralph Stratford, secured a large tract of open land situated just outside the northern city walls. Shortly thereafter, the royal government authorized the emergency purchase of additional adjacent property, effectively establishing the massive emergency cemetery of East Smithfield. Municipal laborers excavated long, deep trenches across the new grounds. Carterers dragged specialized wooden wagons through the streets, collecting the dead and transporting them to the open pits. Workers systematically stacked the bodies in neat, tightly packed rows, 5 deep, carefully maximizing the available space before burying them beneath heavy layers of soil. Archaeological excavations of East Smithfield centuries later revealed the precise, desperate organization of these mass graves, clearly demonstrating how civic authorities maintained strict administrative control over the burial process, even as their city died around them. The sheer scale of the mortality across France, Italy, and England ultimately triggered a catastrophic breakdown of fundamental administrative functions. The intricate bureaucratic systems that governed Western European states simply ceased to operate as the personnel required to maintain them vanished. Royal exchequers and regional treasuries found their vaults emptying as systematic tax collection ground to a complete halt. Sheriffs and bailiffs either perished from the disease or refused to travel into infected villages to gather the king's levies. Local manorial courts, which traditionally managed everything from land disputes to petty crimes, suspended their sessions indefinitely because the presiding lords, clerks, and plaintiffs were dead or missing. This judicial vacuum left vulnerable rural communities without any formal legal recourse, effectively erasing the established mechanisms of medieval law and order. At the highest levels of government, the political machinery paralyzed. Powerful monarchs found themselves entirely unable to convene their royal parliaments or estates general. The required nobility, senior clergy, and wealthy burgesses refused to travel to infected capital cities, fearing for their lives. Royal decrees went unissued, planned military campaigns were abruptly abandoned in the field, and international diplomatic negotiations dissolved into silence. The physical enforcement of state authority evaporated as city watches dwindled and royal garrisons suffered massive casualties. With the sudden collapse of institutional power, local populations were left completely isolated, forced to navigate the unprecedented biological disaster without any protection, guidance, or support from their rulers. This profound vacuum of centralized authority rapidly created an environment of intense fear and extreme vulnerability, laying the groundwork for a radical, desperate transformation in how the surviving populace sought spiritual salvation and exacted brutal justice upon their neighbors. With the traditional mechanisms of law and religious solace completely paralyzed, the surviving populations of Northern Europe endured profound psychological trauma. The daily reality of unceasing mortality, combined with the absolute failure of established medical and civic authorities, drove ordinary citizens to seek extreme spiritual remedies. The devastating psychological impact of burying entire families within days broke the traditional bounds of medieval piety. Believing the pestilence to be a direct physical manifestation of divine wrath, thousands of men abandoned their homes, families, and trades in 1348 to join radical penitential movements. The most prominent and highly organized of these groups, the Flagellants, rapidly mobilized across the fragmented territories of the Holy Roman Empire and the Low Countries. Contemporary chroniclers record massive columns of men marching in strict, silent 2x2 formations along the dusty roads connecting German, Flemish, and Dutch towns. They wore heavy white tunics prominently marked with red crosses on the front and back, and pulled long cowls low over their faces to maintain strict anonymity. Carrying heavy leather whips, these organized bands traveled continuously from city to city, committing themselves to precisely 33.5 days of continuous marching, one day for each year of Christ's earthly life. They marched beneath heavy velvet banners and ringing bells, chanting mournful penitential hymns. Their stated goal was to personally absorb the punishment meant for humanity, appease an angry God, and physically halt the invisible biological slaughter ravaging their communities by subjecting their own bodies to the extreme torments they believed their sins required. Upon entering a new settlement, the flagellant companies marched directly toward the primary church plaza, completely bypassing the local ecclesiastical hierarchy. They formed large, precise circles in the town squares, stripped away their upper garments, and threw themselves onto the cobblestones in rigid postures representing their specific sins. At the shouted command of their lay leader, the master, they rose and began to strike their own backs with their scourges. Heavy leather tails specifically knotted and embedded with sharp iron spikes. The flagellants rhythmically whipped themselves until their flesh tore and blood actively flowed down their torsos, splashing onto the pavement. As they performed this violent self-mutilation, designated members read aloud from a purported heavenly letter, claiming an angel had delivered it to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, explicitly demanding extreme physical penance to save the world from total destruction. This visceral, blood-soaked spectacle completely captivated the traumatized local populations. Desperate townspeople crowded the squares, physically dipping cloths into the spilled blood and treating the wandering penitents as living, holy martyrs. By actively seizing control of the public religious narrative and physically occupying the sacred spaces, the flagellants effectively usurped the authority of the ordained priesthood. Local bishops and parish priests, already decimated by the pathogen and struggling to maintain their influence, watched helplessly as these radical laymen administered their own absolutions, bypassed the established sacraments, and fundamentally challenged the centralized spiritual monopoly of the Catholic Church. The intense, volatile religious fervor sweeping through the traumatized towns quickly mutated into a desperate search for a tangible, human enemy. Unable to physically combat the invisible bacterium, frightened communities sought a localized scapegoat to blame for the relentless dying. Widespread rumors rapidly emerged, systematically accusing marginalized groups, including lepers and foreign pilgrims, of deliberately orchestrating the catastrophic mortality. However, the most lethal and persistent of these accusations specifically targeted the Jewish populations residing within Christian cities. These isolated communities, culturally distinct and often restricted to specific professions like money lending by church law, provided an easily identifiable target for public rage. The rumor claimed that a vast international Jewish conspiracy was actively poisoning the local wells, main rivers, and natural springs of Europe with a lethal, manufactured toxin. Accusers claimed this poisonous powder was carefully composed of crushed spiders, frogs, and human remains, smuggled across borders in small leather pouches. This narrative gained immense, irreversible traction in the autumn of 1348 when municipal authorities in the Savoyard town of Chillon arrested several Jewish residents. Through the extensive, brutal application of judicial torture, including the rack and the strappado, the local interrogators forced these individuals to confess to the elaborate poisoning plot. City scribes meticulously recorded the forced testimonies, officially notarized the fabricated confessions, and aggressively dispatched copies of the transcripts via mounted couriers to neighboring municipalities across Switzerland, the Rhine Valley, and the Bavarian Plains. These official documents provided a thin, powerful veneer of legal justification, instantly transforming localized paranoia into a continent-wide mandate for systematic extermination. Armed with the extracted confessions from Savoy, violent anti-Semitic pogroms erupted in rapid succession across the Rhineland. Heavily armed mobs, often directly organized by local guild leaders and disgruntled minor nobility, attacked the established Jewish quarters in Basel, Frankfurt, Mainz, and Cologne. The violence culminated in a highly organized, politically motivated massacre in the wealthy free imperial city of Strasbourg in February 1349. The serving mayor and the established city council initially attempted to protect the resident Jewish population, recognizing the poisoning accusations as fundamentally baseless and relying heavily on their economic contributions to the municipal treasury. In direct response, a powerful coalition of angry artisans, butchers' guilds, and heavily indebted local nobles stormed the town hall, physically deposed the governing magistrates, and installed a radical new council completely sympathetic to the mob's demands. The newly appointed authorities immediately ordered the arrest of the entire Jewish community. On St. Valentine's Day, municipal guards marched approximately 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children from their homes directly to the main city cemetery. The mob constructed a massive wooden platform, forced the captives inside the structure, and set the entire enclosure on fire. Hundreds of Jewish citizens burned alive, while those who attempted to leap from the flames were struck down by the waiting crowds. Following the massacre, the new city council systematically seized all Jewish property, gathered the financial ledgers, formally canceled all debts owed to Jewish lenders by burning the records, and violently divided the stolen assets. The financial ledgers recording substantial debts owed by the local aristocracy and the urban guilds were systematically burned alongside the victims, revealing the deep economic motives operating beneath the religious fanaticism. The sheer scale and brutality of the Rhineland massacres prompted an immediate, formal response from the highest level of the Catholic hierarchy. Pope Clement VI, actively monitoring the escalating violence from his fortified residence, recognized the unchecked pogroms as a severe disruption of civil order and a direct affront to papal authority. In July and September of 1348, he issued two separate papal bulls, including the Quamvis Perfidium, strictly condemning the persecution of the Jewish communities. The Supreme Pontiff utilized cold, empirical logic to systematically dismantle the poisoned well accusations. He explicitly stated in the official church documents that Jewish populations were contracting the plague and dying at the exact same catastrophic rates as the Christian populations surrounding them. Furthermore, Clement VI pointed out the geographic reality that the mysterious pestilence was simultaneously ravaging isolated regions where absolutely no Jews lived. He explicitly ordered all bishops, archbishops, and local clergy to actively protect the Jewish populations within their respective dioceses, threatening those who participated in the pogroms with the severe spiritual penalty of excommunication. Moving beyond written decrees, the Pope actively transformed his own sovereign territories into a physical sanctuary. He opened the heavily guarded gates of Avignon and the surrounding papal estates in the Comtat Venaissin to fleeing Jewish refugees. The papacy offered them armed protection and direct legal immunity from the roaming mobs, radical flagellant bands, and opportunistic nobles actively exploiting the crisis. Clement VI deployed papal guards to patrol the borders of his domain, ensuring that the arriving refugees could find temporary shelter away from the chaotic violence consuming the neighboring French and German principalities. Despite the clear, rational directives issued by the papacy, the established mechanisms of localized law enforcement had already completely disintegrated across much of Western Europe. The papal bulls, lacking any secular military force to physically enforce their mandates, were routinely ignored by terrified town councils and aggressive civilian mobs. Regional dukes and municipal magistrates either actively participated in the massacres to confiscate wealth or simply stood aside, entirely powerless to stop the heavily armed citizenry from storming the Jewish quarters. Consequently, the systematic eradication of Jewish communities proceeded with ruthless efficiency throughout the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, and parts of the Iberian Peninsula. Entire centuries-old urban settlements were reduced to ashes, their surviving residents violently stripped of their possessions and rendered completely stateless. Faced with the stark reality of total physical annihilation, thousands of surviving Jewish families gathered whatever transportable wealth remained and initiated a massive, coordinated migration eastward. They loaded wooden carts and traveled across the devastated, hostile continent toward the Kingdom of Poland. King Casimir III actively welcomed the refugees, issuing royal charters that explicitly guaranteed their personal safety, granted them broad freedom of worship, and legally protected their commercial activities. The Polish crown strategically utilized this sudden influx of educated, skilled urban populations to aggressively develop its own domestic economy and establish new, highly lucrative trade networks. As the surviving populations across Western Europe slowly emerged from the immediate terror of the massacres and the waning biological contagion, the vast, empty agricultural tracts and the deeply depleted labor forces presented a completely new, structural crisis for the landed nobility. By the year 1351, the relentless biological assault that had swept across the European continent finally began to subside. The initial, catastrophic wave of the Yersinia pestis pathogen burned itself out as the highly vulnerable populations were either dead or had acquired natural immunity. The receding plague left behind a profoundly altered geographic and demographic landscape. Across the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the British Isles, silent, empty villages dotted the countryside, while entire city districts stood abandoned and slowly decaying. Contemporary manorial rolls and parish registers from across the continent reveal a staggering demographic collapse. Historians calculate that Western Europe lost approximately one-third to one-half of its total population within a span of merely 4 years. The physical evidence of this sudden demographic void covered the land. Vast tracts of formerly cultivated agricultural fields rapidly returned to wild forest and untamed scrubland. Livestock wandered untended through ruined fences, and untethered sheep starved in the pastures without shepherds to guide them to winter grazing. The sheer scale of the mortality fundamentally destabilized the foundational bedrock of the medieval European economy. For centuries, the entire feudal system had relied heavily upon an endless, easily exploitable surplus of peasant labor to generate agricultural wealth for the landed aristocracy. As the surviving European nobility emerged from their fortified estates and isolated castles, they discovered that the massive, obedient workforce required to maintain their immense wealth and privileged social standing had simply vanished. This unprecedented labor shortage immediately transferred an extraordinary degree of economic leverage directly into the hands of the surviving peasantry. Before the plague, medieval serfs were legally bound to their lord's estate, required by strict manorial law to provide unpaid physical labor on the lord's personal lands in exchange for the right to cultivate their own small subsistence plots. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, the stark reality of the empty fields shattered this ancient power dynamic. Landlords desperately needed strong workers to harvest the rotting crops and shear the surviving sheep before the winter destroyed their remaining agricultural capital. Recognizing their newfound scarcity and immense value, the peasants actively refused to perform their traditional, unpaid labor obligations. They threw down their scythes and openly demanded substantially higher daily wages, significantly lower annual rents, and vastly improved living conditions. When local barons refused to meet these unprecedented demands, agricultural laborers simply packed their meager belongings and walked away. They traveled along the open roads to neighboring estates or rival manors where desperate landowners readily offered illegal bonuses, better housing, and improved rations to secure their physical labor. This widespread, spontaneous peasant mobility actively dismantled the strict territorial control that had defined European feudalism for centuries, sparking intense panic among the aristocratic ruling class. The deeply threatened landowning elites immediately leveraged their absolute control over state governments to forcefully suppress the rising power of the working classes. In the Kingdom of England, King Edward III reacted swiftly to protect the economic interests of his nobility. In 1349, the English crown issued the Ordinance of Labourers, a sweeping royal decree specifically designed to artificially manipulate the collapsing labor market. When the royal parliament formally reconvened 2 years later, it permanently codified these emergency measures by passing the Statute of Labourers in 1351. This aggressive legislation explicitly ordered all able-bodied men and women under the age of 60 to accept employment at the exact wage rates that had existed in 1346, completely ignoring the drastic economic realities of the post-plague world. Furthermore, the newly enacted laws strictly prohibited peasants from migrating out of their home villages in search of higher-paying jobs. To enforce these draconian measures, the English government empowered local justices of the peace to actively hunt down, arrest, and physically brand runaway laborers with hot irons. Similar legislative efforts to freeze wages and restrict movement appeared across the continent, from the courts of the French crown to the regional assemblies of the Iberian kingdoms. The ruling classes deliberately utilized the full judicial and punitive apparatus of the medieval state to artificially maintain the crumbling feudal hierarchy, attempting to violently force the surviving peasantry back into an economic system that no longer aligned with the demographic reality. Despite the brutal implementation of the royal statutes, the severe economic forces unleashed by the massive population loss proved entirely unstoppable. The rigid socio-economic structures of manorialism began to permanently disintegrate under the intense pressure of the open market. Landlords faced a stark, unavoidable choice: either stubbornly adhere to the traditional, legally mandated feudal structures and watch their vast estates go completely unharvested, or actively break the royal laws to survive economically. Practical necessity rapidly overwhelmed aristocratic tradition. Estate managers and wealthy abbots quietly bypassed the royal courts and actively competed against one another for the scarce workforce. They secretly paid inflated wages, offered lucrative signing bonuses, and provided better daily rations of meat and ale to attract wandering laborers. To retain the workers already living on their lands, lords were forced to fundamentally alter the terms of medieval servitude. They systematically commuted the ancient, despised labor services into simple, fixed cash rents. Instead of working 3 days a week on the lord's domain, peasants now paid a set amount of silver coins for their land, freeing them to focus entirely on their own agricultural production. Across Western Europe, manorial courts formally recorded the wholesale manumission of serfs, who eagerly purchased their legal freedom using the higher wages they had recently accumulated. The traditional feudal estate, based upon bound servitude and forced labor, rapidly transformed into a modern system of leased tenant farming and paid agricultural wage labor. This fundamental restructuring of the agricultural economy triggered a massive, continent-wide economic realignment that radically altered the distribution of European wealth. The sudden, catastrophic mortality rate resulted in a massive concentration of property and hard currency among the survivors. Peasants who previously cultivated tiny, exhausted strips of land suddenly inherited the fertile plots, livestock, and saved coins of their deceased neighbors and extended family members. This unprecedented accumulation of wealth at the lower levels of society ignited a massive surge in consumer demand. Ordinary laborers actively abandoned their traditional, coarse woolen garments and basic diets of oat pottage. They utilized their new purchasing power to demand fine Flemish cloth, imported spices, manufactured leather goods, and highly refined wheat bread. This sudden shift in consumer habits profoundly stimulated urban manufacturing and international trade. City artisans abandoned the mass production of cheap, low-quality goods and pivoted aggressively toward crafting luxury items for a suddenly wealthy working class. The economic vacuum left by the decimated nobility allowed a completely new merchant middle class to rise rapidly to prominence. Wealthy wool merchants, successful guild masters, and international bankers began purchasing vast tracts of bankrupt aristocratic estates. They actively married their children into deeply indebted noble families, effectively blurring the rigid, ancient lines between the aristocratic warrior class and the wealthy commercial bourgeoisie. The immense structural changes reshaping the European economy were mirrored by a profound, psychological transformation within medieval cultural and religious expression. The relentless, inescapable trauma of burying millions of victims fundamentally altered how the surviving populations perceived their own mortality. Artists, writers, and theologians largely abandoned the idealized, serene religious imagery of the preceding centuries. In its place, a dark, obsessive, and intensely death-focused artistic motif emerged, aggressively sweeping across the churches, illuminated manuscripts, and cemetery walls of Europe. The Danse Macabre, or the Dance of Death. Contemporary painters depicted rotting corpses and animated skeletons actively leading the living in a haunting, unbroken chain toward the grave. These visceral artworks prominently featured the Grim Reaper violently seizing kings, popes, wealthy merchants, and impoverished peasants with absolute equality. The Danse Macabre served as a stark, visual reminder that the biological devastation had completely ignored social hierarchy, wealth, and divine right. The immense power of the medieval church and the absolute authority of the feudal lords had proven entirely hollow in the face of the invisible pathogen. This egalitarian artistic expression perfectly captured the deeply fractured mindset of the post-plague generation. The old, unquestioned reverence for established authority had died alongside the victims of the pandemic, replaced by a cynical, hardened populace fully aware of their own economic value and deeply skeptical of the ruling elites. Emboldened by their accumulated wealth and bitterly resentful of the oppressive royal statutes attempting to restrain them, the newly empowered working classes began to organize and arm themselves in the rural villages and urban guild halls. If history fascinates you, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting to be told.